They once called it medicine, yet the tools looked far closer to weapons. Every blade, clamp, and saw carried a story no healer ever admitted, and every patient learned too late what truly waited behind the chamber door. The past did not hide its cruelty, only softened its edges enough for us to look without turning away. Tonight, we walk back into those rooms and listen to what the metal never forgot. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into a Tudor treatment chamber, the first thing to settle in the mind would not be the hope of healing, but the uneasy sense that the room had been prepared for something else entirely. The air felt dense, as though heavy with the breath of those who had come before, leaving behind traces of fear that clung to the wooden beams. The tools lay on a narrow table, arranged with a kind of order that made them even more intimidating. Their edges dulled not by design but by overuse. Nothing here suggested comfort. Nothing suggested mercy. What passed for medicine in this age was a thin curtain, stretched over methods that shared more with punishment than care. People came because they had nowhere else to turn. Illness stalked Tudor streets with a patience that felt almost personal, and those struck down by fever, swelling, or weakness were urged to seek a healer. Yet, the line between healing and hurting was so thin that most simply hoped to survive the visit. The healers themselves rarely questioned their own procedures. A cut was a cut, whether meant to remove sickness or enforce obedience. The exposed body, pale under dim candlelight, became a surface on which authority wrote its decisions. For many, the treatment left marks deeper than the illness ever did. Those who entered these rooms often carried a belief, whispered for generations, that suffering was necessary for recovery. Pain was not feared by the healer. It was welcomed as proof that the body was being corrected. A man with a swollen limb might be ordered to place it on the board while a blade hovered above, its purpose delivered with no more explanation than a stern look. A woman with persistent headaches might be told her skull required release, as though her bone were a sealed vessel holding back darkness. There was no argument in these encounters. Submission was expected, and silence became a second form of restraint. The tools, cold, heavy, and handled with ungloved hands, were reflections of the beliefs that shaped them. A knife that cut too deeply was still considered useful. A saw that left splinters of bone was praised for speed. A clamp that bruised the skin was admired for its strength. Illness was never treated gently, and neither were the bodies that suffered from it. What mattered was action. Inaction was viewed as a moral failing, a sign that one lacked the courage to confront sickness with force. And so force became the foundation of care. The distinction between medicine and punishment blurred further in poorer districts. There, healers often doubled as local enforcers of discipline, settling disputes with the same steady hand that opened abscesses. A patient who cried out too loudly might be struck or restrained. Resistance was interpreted as an element of the illness itself, an imbalance that justified tighter binding and harsher methods. The tools served as both remedy and warning, their presence reminding all who entered that the body could be altered, corrected, or subdued without question. Some residents spoke quietly of friends or relatives who had sought treatment only to emerge weaker. Their wounds multiplied rather than relieved. These accounts spread through kitchens and taverns. Yet even fear could not fully keep people away. Illness offered no alternatives. A neighbour might die in his sleep. A child might collapse in the yard. When the body faltered, desperation outweighed caution. Even knowing the risks, families carried their sick to the nearest healer. whispering encouragement, not out of faith but out of hope that the gods of chance might be kind. What went unspoken in these rooms was the reality that many did not return. Those who managed to walk away bore the scent of herbs and blood, mingling into something that clung to their clothing long after they left. Those who did not walk away were carried out wrapped in cloth, their families told that the illness had simply been too strong. Few questioned this. To speak against a healer invited suspicion, and in a world governed by hierarchy and fear, suspicion was a dangerous thing. Even so, there were moments when silence cracked. A mother might stare too long at the stains on a healer's tools, wondering how many others they had touched. A father might hesitate before allowing a blade to come near his child. But hesitation had no place in Tudor care. The healer decided, and the patient endured. To refuse treatment was considered foolish, even sinful. Illness was a force of nature, and healers were the only ones bold enough to confront it with steel. Standing in such a chamber, one would sense the strange tension between confidence and ignorance. The healer felt certain that each cut, burn, and pressure served a purpose, yet the truth, unknown to them, but painfully visible in hindsight, was that more people died from these interventions than from the ailments themselves. The tools were not merely instruments, they were verdicts. Once they touched flesh, the outcome became unpredictable, shaped less by skill than by chance. The room felt still, but beneath the stillness was the echo of countless silent endings. What lingered most was not the sight of the tools, though they were unsettling enough, but the quiet acceptance that surrounded them. Families waited outside with bowed heads, hearing muffled cries and clattering metal, telling themselves it was all for the best. Pain was seen as progress, blood was seen as cleansing, death was seen as fate, and in a world where the boundary between treatment and torment remained unseen, hope took the shape of endurance rather than healing. By the time the candle burned low, the healer's workbench would glisten with damp metal, and the floorboards would bear marks of another struggle. The patient, whether living or gone, would leave the room changed. Those who survived often carried their fear into the next generation, passing down a quiet dread of anything that resembled medical care. The legacy of these chambers was not recovery, but resignation. What happened here reveals how survival and fear walked side by side in Tudor medicine. Yet beyond this doorway, the tools grow sharper and the intentions more uncertain. And somewhere ahead, a moment waits when the boundary between healing and harm dissolves entirely. The first sound inside a Tudor chamber was often enough to drain the colour from a patient's face. Metal scraped against metal in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though the blade were waking from sleep. That sound filled the room long before the healer spoke, settling into the walls, the floorboards, and the minds of those waiting their turn. It was not the sound of preparation, it was the sound of warning. People who stood outside the door swore they could feel the vibration through the wood, and more than one patient collapsed before ever seeing the blade itself. Fear, in these places, announced itself quietly. The room that waited beyond the threshold did not resemble a place of hope. It held the dimness of a cellar and the silence of a place meant to hide suffering. The single window, if there was one, offered no comfort. Its glass stained by years of smoke and damp. Shadows stretched across the walls like cords pulled tight. And the wooden table in the centre carried the marks of those who had gripped its edges too hard. Everything in the chamber felt tense, as if the space itself remembered what had happened inside it. The tools rested in plain view. They were not displayed proudly, nor were they hidden away. They sat in a shallow tray, arranged with an unsettling sense of purpose, catching candlelight on their dull metallic surfaces, knives with thick handles, hooks shaped with no softness, clamps that locked shut with a sound sharper than the pain they produced. None of them looked like they had ever been designed for healing. Their edges carried the story of countless bodies, yet no cloth lay beside them for cleaning. The healer believed in readiness, not hygiene. Many who entered the chamber tried to steady their breath, telling themselves that the tools were harmless until used. But when the healer reached for a blade and began the simple act of sharpening it, the illusion shattered. The scraping sound struck the patients more deeply than the steel ever would. It reminded them that pain was not a possibility, but an expectation. Each stroke across the sharpening stone created a whisper that worked its way under the skin. A whisper that told them escape was no longer an option. Those with weak hearts were the first to falter. Their knees bent, their hands trembled, and the world narrowed to the rhythmic hiss of metal. It was not uncommon for someone to faint before the healer even approached. To the healer, this was an inconvenience. To the waiting families, it was a sign of what awaited. The chamber was not a place where people came to be made whole. It was a place where bodies were tested, broken, and sometimes returned with fewer pieces than they arrived with. Despite this, the healer moved without hesitation. They lifted each tool with the calmness of someone choosing bread at a market stall, paying no attention to the reactions around them. The tools did not frighten the healer, because they had forgotten fear long ago. In their mind, pain was an ingredient, necessary, measured, and inevitable. They believed the patient must endure it to be restored, and those who could not endure simply did not survive. Healing, as they understood it, demanded submission. The chamber's atmosphere tightened whenever the blade left the stone. Patients felt their breath shorten, the room shrinking around them. The healer never explained what would happen. They simply acted as if the patient had already agreed to everything. Those watching the procedure often pressed their backs to the wall, trying to become part of it, trying not to hear each metallic tap or scrape. They knew these sounds too well. They were the soundtrack of Tudor suffering, echoing through towns and alleys long after the work was done. Children were the most vulnerable. They sensed fear faster than adults, responding not to the tools themselves, but to the way grown men looked away from them. Their cries began the moment the metal appeared. Some begged to leave, clutching their parents with desperate fingers. Others fell silent, as though their bodies understood that silence was safer. Neither reaction changed the healer's pace. The blade continued to rise and fall, its metallic breath steady and indifferent. The unsettling truth was that many of these instruments were originally forged for purposes entirely unrelated to medicine. Blades meant for livestock, hooks meant for leather. Clamps are designed for binding, not mending. But in a world lacking structured care, anything made of metal was repurposed into a tool of healing, or what passed for healing. The transformation did nothing to soothe those who saw them. The resemblance to execution devices was too strong, too obvious. Patients entered the chamber knowing that even a simple procedure might end with darkness instead of relief. What frightened people most was not the pain itself, but the anticipation. The room forced them to imagine the moment of contact. The cold steel meeting warm flesh, the first cut, the breath that escaped involuntarily, even before the blade touched skin. Fear carved its own wounds, and the healer, unbothered by emotion, continued the ritual of metallic preparation that had become as much a part of treatment as the act itself. To witness such a scene now would feel like stepping into a world where compassion had been removed, replaced by duty and routine. Yet, for Tudor patients, this was simply life. A chamber that looked like a torture room was still called a clinic. A blade shaped like a weapon was still called a tool. And the sound of metal, steady, sharp, and merciless, became the voice of medicine itself. The stillness within these walls reveals how fear was woven into every act of Tudor healing. Yet beyond the trembling metal, larger shadows wait in the corners, where tools begin to claim more than flesh. And somewhere ahead, the line between treatment and torment narrows until it nearly disappears. The knife rested on the wooden table as if it had been waiting for someone foolish enough to trust it. Its blade was long and thick, narrowing to a point that caught the dim candlelight in a way that felt less like reflection and more like a warning. Dried blood clung to the metal in dark, stubborn lines, layered from countless uses, each stain a silent trace of the bodies it had already entered. No cloth lay nearby, no water basin, no sign that the healer intended to clean the blade before letting it touch another life. In Tudor medicine, the knife was not refreshed between patients. It simply continued its work, carrying whatever it collected. When the healer picked it up, the motion was slow but confident. The familiarity of someone lifting a tool used so many times it had become an extension of their hand. The blade's weight pulled slightly downward, and the handle, polished only by sweat and repetition, fit into the healer's grip as though shaped by it. For the patient lying on the narrow bench, the sight of the blade was enough to make their breath falter. It was not just the thought of being cut. It was the undeniable sense that the blade had already met too many others before them. The smell around the knife held a mixture of rust, old blood, and damp wood, combining into something that clung to the air with unsettling persistence. People often notice the scent before noticing the blade itself, their minds trying to place it, their bodies tensing as if warning them to turn away. But there was no turning away. Illness forced them to remain. Hope, thin and fragile, held them against the bench while the healer prepared to use a tool that had already delivered more suffering than salvation. Those who had been treated before spoke quietly of how the knife dragged rather than sliced, its dull edges tearing skin instead of cutting cleanly. Each cut took effort, requiring the healer to press harder or repeat the motion, turning a single wound into several. Patients described the sensation as a burning that spread outward, sometimes reaching the bone, although the healer would insist the pain was simply part of the process. The blade's dullness was not a flaw, it was a condition of the time. Sharpening wore it down. Cleaning it was considered unnecessary. Steel did not fear sickness. So why should sickness fear steel? What no one understood then was how easily disease travelled along the blade. The knife had tasted plague sores, infections, and wounds filled with decay. It moved from one patient to the next, carrying with it invisible threats that the healer could not see and did not believe existed. When someone died after treatment, the illness was blamed, not the blade. When several fell ill in the same household after visiting the same healer, it was called misfortune. The idea that the knife itself could be the source of death was unimaginable. People trusted metal more than they trusted their own bodies. The healer's focus remained solely on the act of cutting. They never paused to consider what clung to the blade. Instead, they prepared the patient by pressing a hand firmly against the area to be opened, feeling for heat, swelling, or hardness beneath the skin. Once satisfied, they lifted the knife with deliberate calm. The patient often gripped the edge of the table, their knuckles whitening as they braced for the first strike. Crying out was common, though it rarely changed anything. The healer kept going, believing the cut must be made, even if the patient trembled or begged for breath between strokes. Blood from the fresh wound mixed with remnants of older blood on the blade, creating a dark, wet sheen that dripped onto the floor or onto the healer's hands. The chamber floor was marked by these moments. Thin lines, small puddles, stains that never fully disappeared. The knife was wiped only when the healer felt it necessary, often against the cloth of their own sleeve or apron, smearing the mixture rather than removing it. The act was practical, not sanitary. Cleanliness had no place in Tudor medicine. Those who survived these treatments often developed fevers a few days later, their wounds darkened, edges turning hard and swollen. Families gathered around the bedside with herbs, prayers, or whispered hopes, unaware that the danger had entered their loved one not through illness, but through intervention. Some recovered despite the contamination. Many did not. Their deaths were folded into the rhythm of Tudor life, where survival depended as much on chance as on care. The knife, however, remained. It was returned to the table after each use, still streaked with whatever it had collected. No ritual marked its rest. No hesitation marked its next use. It served the healer faithfully, though never kindly, and those who saw it, especially those waiting their turn, felt the weight of its history in the room. The blade did not need to speak. Its silence was enough. It is unsettling to imagine a world where such a tool was trusted so completely, where the belief in the healer overshadowed the evidence carved into the very metal they held. Yet this was the reality for Tudor patients. A knife meant to save them often carried the very thing that would destroy them. And still, they endured, because fear of illness was greater than fear of the blade. The blade's long history of use reveals how danger lived quietly inside Tudor medicine. Yet, as the tools grow darker, their touch begins to decide more than simple fate. Somewhere ahead, another instrument waits with a purpose far more brutal than its appearance suggests. Metal rested on the healer's table with an unsettling stillness. Its thick arms curved inward, as if built for restraint rather than relief. The jaws at the end were blunt, rigid, and far too large for the narrow passage they were meant to enter. Nothing about the device suggested gentleness, and nothing about its purpose offered comfort. Patients who saw it tended to fall silent in a way that felt deeper than fear, more like resignation. The chamber itself seemed to tighten whenever this instrument was chosen, as though the room understood the suffering that would soon unfold. Patients were told to lie down, but fear made their bodies stiffen rather than sink into the wooden bench. No cloth was offered to bite, no herbs to dull sensation, no promise that the pain would pass quickly. The healer believed in endurance, not mercy. They approached with a confidence that felt almost indifferent, lifting the instrument with the steady hands of someone who had used it far too many times. For the patient, that steadiness provided no reassurance. If anything, it made the moment worse. Metal met skin with a coldness that carried its own kind of warning. The healer positioned the jaws at the opening of the urethra, paying no attention to the patient's trembling. Pain arrived instantly, not as a build, but as a sudden, tearing heat that cut through thoughts and breath alike. The instrument pushed deeper, scraping against tissue never meant to encounter metal. Those who experienced it described the sensation as a burning that spread upward, each inch worse than the last. The healer did not slow. They listened only to the faint vibrations inside the body, searching for the stone as though navigating by sound alone. The jaws opened and closed with mechanical patience, attempting to trap the hidden mass. Sometimes the tool caught nothing. Sometimes it caught only flesh. When it finally closed around the stone, the pressure shifted into agony, so sharp that even the breath escaping the patient's mouth seemed to tremble. Muscles spasmed, hands clawed at the table, and vision blurred into streaks of candlelight and shadow. Yet the healer continued, unaware or unconcerned with the body's breaking point. Extraction was worse than insertion. The stone, now firmly gripped between the jaws, dragged against torn tissue on its way back out. Blood followed the instrument in thin, bright lines, dripping onto the healer's hand and staining the wood beneath the table. Many patients fainted before the device emerged, collapsing into limp silence. Some remained barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness as pain pulled at the edges of their mind. A few suffered so violently that their hearts simply failed, leaving their bodies still while the healer's hands continued to work. Shock took others quickly, skin paling, lips tightening, eyes staring unfocused at the ceiling. These deaths were quiet, often occurring before the healer stepped back. Families waiting outside were rarely told the truth. They heard words like weakness, severity, or unfortunate decline, never suspecting that the instrument itself carried more danger than the illness. Tudor life left little room for questioning authority, especially when desperation made people accept even the cruelest forms of treatment. Survivors faced long recoveries. Every small movement brought sharp reminders of torn tissue. Urine darkened with blood. Fever crept through the nights. An infection hovered like a shadow, waiting for the right moment to take hold. Some lived, though weakened. Some faded slowly in the days that followed. But the healer's tool remained unchanged by their suffering. It was wiped once across a sleeve, placed back among the others, and considered ready for use again. No cleansing water touched it. No understanding of infection guided its handling. Metal carried memories from one body to the next, and each patient, unknowingly, inherited whatever the previous one had endured. The tool's brutal shape made its purpose clear. Yet the healer saw only necessity. In a world without anesthesia, without understanding, without safer alternatives, pain became an accepted currency. Something paid because no one believed another option existed. Modern eyes struggle to comprehend how such a device could ever have been trusted. How fear and hope could coexist so closely on a wooden bench in a dim Tudor chamber. Yet this was the reality of the time. Suffering was expected, and survival was never guaranteed. Tools meant to heal often became instruments of harm, and those who endured them carried the memory long after the wound itself had closed. This harsh device exposes how Tudor medicine demanded pain in its pursuit of a cure. Yet deeper within these dim chambers lie instruments that claim more than they return. Within the coming shadows waits a tool whose purpose cuts closer to the boundary between life and loss. Metal, meant for separation, rested on the healer's bench in a grim stillness, as if aware of the finality it delivered. Axes dulled by repetition, saws with teeth uneven from tearing through flesh and bone, and curved blades, shaped for swift arcs. All of them carried the weighted silence of tools that did not simply touch the body but altered the course of a life the moment they were lifted. Patients rarely looked at these instruments for more than a heartbeat. The mind refused to linger on objects designed not for correction, but for removal. The procedure began long before steel met skin. It started when the healer ordered the patient to be restrained. Ropes wrapped around wrists and ankles, tightened until veins rose beneath the surface. Some patients struggled in panic. Others went motionless, hollowed out by fear. But the result was always the same: immobility. Assistants pressed their palms onto the patient's chest or shoulders, holding the body still in preparation for what would come. Without restraint, the violence of the cut would send limbs thrashing, breaking any chance the healer had of completing the task. In Tudor medicine, stillness was forced, not chosen. No voice offered comfort. No drug softened the edges of awareness. The patient faced the moment with full consciousness, exposed to every sound and every sensation. The healer examined the limb briefly, not looking for the best place to preserve function. Such concerns belonged to later centuries, but simply identifying where the blade could pass through quickly. Speed mattered more than precision. Pain would be overwhelming, and the body could bear only so much before slipping into shock or silence. When the blade finally lifted, the room seemed to draw inward. The first strike landed with a force that startled even those who had witnessed the procedure before. Flesh split under the blow, and blood surged outward in a rapid bloom. Warm and metallic in the air. If the blade was sharp enough, and the healer strong enough, the limb might nearly separate in one attempt. But such moments were rare. More often, the healer needed several cuts, each one digging deeper, each one forcing a cry from the patient that dissolved into ragged gasps. For those who used saws, the sound was unforgettable. Teeth grated against bone, creating a harsh rhythm that cut not just through the limb, but through the silence of everyone in the room. Assistants tightened their grip, bracing their weight against the patient's spasming body. The saw moved back and forth in steady strokes, each pull widening the gap, each push sending vibrations through the entire frame of the patient. Some lost consciousness early, slipping into darkness as a mercy their minds granted. Others remained awake for far too long, trapped in a body that could not escape its unraveling. Blood pooled beneath the table, soaking through wood, a cloth, and skin. The healer worked quickly, knowing that time itself threatened the patient as much as the blade. Too slow, and the heart would falter. Too hesitant, and the pain would overwhelm the mind, sending it into irreversible collapse. The healer's hands, stained and steady, moved with a practiced urgency that revealed both experience and resignation. They had performed this before. They would perform it again. Once the limb detached, there was no pause for grief. Assistants wrapped the stump in cloth, pressing down hard to slow the bleeding. Some healers applied heated irons to sear the wound shut, a moment that brought its own scream, its own shock, its own brutal mark left behind. The removed limb was discarded without ceremony, placed on a pile, or dropped into a corner until someone had time to bury or burn it. In rooms where several amputations were performed in a single day, the air grew thick with the iron scent of blood and the faint, sweet odor of cauterized flesh. Survival depended on more than the procedure. Infection lurked in every corner of Tudor life, waiting to claim those too weak to fight it. Many patients died in the days that followed, their bodies failing under fever and decay. Those who lived carried the memory not just of the missing limb, but of the moment it was taken. The sound of steel, the pressure of hands holding them down, the gasp that escaped when bone gave way. Amputation was not simply a medical act. It was a crossing between worlds, a violent negotiation between life and death. Modern minds struggle to reconcile how a procedure so brutal could be seen as salvation. Yet in Tudor times, amputation was often the only barrier between a person and a painful, prolonged end. The healer believed that removing the limb meant removing the illness, even when the illness was something the blade could never reach. The tool's power lay not in its precision, but in its finality. This violent act reveals how Tudor healing often demanded the sacrifice of flesh to preserve a fading chance at survival. Yet deeper in these chambers lie methods that wound even when they claimed to mend. In the dim quiet ahead, another instrument waits to leave its mark long before any cure can take hold. Speed ruled the chamber in a way no other force could. When a limb needed to be removed, every heartbeat counted, and the healer approached the table with a focus sharpened not by compassion but by necessity. The saw rested in their dominant hand, its teeth uneven from countless amputations, its handle worn smooth where sweat and urgency had soaked into the wood. The patient, bound tightly to prevent instinctive resistance, watched the tool with a terror that stretched time thin. But time had no intention of slowing. In Tudor medicine, hesitation killed faster than the blade. The healer's reputation depended not on the beauty of the cut or the neatness of the closure, but on the speed of the separation. Under 60 seconds, this was the silent measure of skill. Anything longer allowed shock to tighten its grip, allowed pain to overwhelm consciousness, allowed blood to drain too quickly to be contained. Families outside whispered stories of healers who could sever a limb in less than a minute, though no one truly wanted to see such speed demonstrated. Those stories existed at the threshold between awe and dread. Before the saw touched skin, the patient's breath collapsed into shallow fragments. Sweat gathered at the temples. Muscles tensed beneath the ropes, leaving deep indentations where the restraint bit into flesh. Assistants leaned in, ready to hold the body against the violence of the procedure. The healer pressed the teeth of the saw against the marked point, and for one suspended instant. The entire room existed in silence. Then movement began. The first pull of the saw tore through skin, with a sound that seemed to rip the air itself. No one mistook it for anything else. It was the unmistakable rhythm of wood-like steel dragging through living tissue. Blood surfaced immediately, spilling along the saw's teeth in small, bright beads. The healer worked with rapid, practiced strokes, their arm moving in a steady arc that revealed how often they had performed this exact act. The patient's scream, when it came, fractured into raw sound. Brief, broken, extinguished quickly as the mind struggled to keep its grip. Halfway through the cut, the bone resisted the saw. The grinding that followed created a sensation that vibrated through the patient's entire body. A deep internal tremor, impossible to escape. Assistants pushed harder on the shoulders and hips, bracing against involuntary thrashing that could turn the saw's path deadly. The healer did not look up. Their pulse matched the rhythm of the blade. Speed mattered most here. A pause could open a window for death. The healer pressed forward, ignoring the metallic scent that thickened the air and the warmth of blood on their hands. The saw's teeth darkened as they filled with fragments of bone and flesh. But cleaning was impossible mid-procedure. Every second consumed a little more of the patient's strength. Every stroke forced their fading consciousness toward the edge. When the final resistance gave way, the limb detached with a sudden release, falling away from the body like something discarded by the earth itself. The assistant stepped back only long enough to prevent it from hitting the floor. The healer immediately pressed cloth over the exposed stump, their movements swift and mechanical. Sometimes heated irons were applied to seal the wound, sending a burst of smoke and a brief cry through the chamber. Other times, the cloth was simply tied so tightly that circulation surrendered to pressure. Patients who survived the minute-long ordeal rarely remembered the moment the limb left their body. Their minds fractured under the strain, retreating into a dim corner where the saw's grinding could no longer reach them. Some drifted into unconsciousness before the final stroke. Others slipped into shock immediately after, their bodies trembling violently as though rejecting the sudden absence of bone and flesh. The healer stepped away only when bleeding slowed, leaving assistants to manage the rest. But not everyone returned from the edge. Those who died did so quietly, eyes glazing over, breaths thinning into silence. Families received the news with resignation, told that the illness, not the saw, had claimed their loved one. No one dared question whether the healer's speed had saved a life or taken it faster than the disease ever could. In Tudor times, a body on the table represented a contest between blade and fate did not always allow a victor. It is jarring now to imagine a world where a person's survival depended on a healer's ability to saw through bone within a single breath of a minute. Yet for Tudor patients, this was the closest thing they had to hope. Speed was salvation. Speed was the only mercy the chamber knew. This ruthless urgency reveals how Tudor medicine valued seconds more than suffering. Yet deeper in these corridors lie tools that silence breath long before any cure is attempted. Within the dimness ahead waits another method whose touch erases more than pain. Iron waited on the healer's table with a heaviness that felt deliberate, as though the tool itself understood the violence it was expected to perform. Its jaws were thick and clamped shut with a force too absolute for anything delicate. The handles, long and weighted, bore marks from years of gripping, indentations where hands had tightened during moments of struggle. No one mistook this device for anything gentle. It was a tool built for removal, for rupture, for ending whatever part of the body it closed around. Patients stepped into the chamber with the taste of strong liquor still burning their throats. The drink was meant to steady them, though it rarely did. It dulled nothing, softened nothing, and only served as a reminder of what awaited. Fear gathered behind the teeth even before the healer approached, turning breath shallow and stiff. In Tudor life, No one questioned why pain was met with iron instead of care, why the remedy for a toothache involved as much violence as the ailment itself. A person came to the healer because they had no choice, and the healer answered with metal. The examination, if it could be called that, lasted only long enough for the healer to decide which tooth would be taken. Fingers prodded the swollen gum, pressing until the patient winced. The healer nodded, not out of understanding, but out of confirmation that the suffering was located. Then the iron forceps were lifted, their weight shifting the air. The patient often gripped the chair or the arms of an assistant, knowing full well that nothing in the room would spare them from what was coming. When the jaws of the tool entered the mouth, they brought the cold taste of metal, dust, and something faintly acidic from years of use. The healer maneuvered the forceps with abrupt confidence, forcing the mouth wider, pinching the gum, scraping enamel. There was no attempt at gentleness. Pain ignited instantly, sharp and electric, radiating upward into the jaw and across the skull. The patient's breath broke into fragments, leaking out between clenched sounds that rose toward a scream. Once the tool locked around the tooth, the real suffering began. The healer did not pull delicately. They wrenched. They twisted. The motion shook through the patient's entire frame, rattling the bones of the face as though the skull itself were being forced apart. Roots tore from their beds with a sound that vibrated inside the head. Wet, cracking, final. Sometimes the tooth came free in a single brutal motion. More often, it brought pieces of gum, shards of bone, and threads of tissue with it. Blood filled the mouth before the patient understood that the scream they heard was their own. Assistants held the patient steady, pressing their shoulders down as the healer leaned back for leverage. The force exerted during these moments could dislocate a jaw or fracture an already weakened bone. Some patients went rigid with shock, their eyes wide and unfocused. Others thrashed until exhaustion subdued them. The healer rarely paused. They examined the bloody tooth, nodded at their own work, and moved on. The tool, still dripping, was wiped on a sleeve or apron before being set aside, ready for the next mouth. For many, the ordeal did not end when the tooth was gone. The empty socket throbbed with an intensity that made thought impossible. Blood pooled, clotted, and sometimes refused to stop. Infection followed frequently, crawling from the wound into the jaw and spreading with the slow persistence of fire under damp wood. Some patients returned days later with faces swollen beyond recognition, only to face the iron again. Others never returned at all, fading in small, dark rooms where fever replaced breath. The chamber in which these extractions took place absorbed the echoes of every scream. The walls held them, the wooden floorboards remembered them, and even the forceps seemed to grow heavier with each life it altered. The healer did not question this weight. Pain was part of the process. Blood was expected. Suffering was the unspoken price of survival. In a world without anesthesia, without understanding, and without alternative, iron dictated the limits of endurance. Modern eyes recoil at such a scene, at the thought of a tooth removed by brute force alone, without even the pretense of comfort. But for Tudor patients, this was ordinary. A toothache could kill, and iron was the only answer anyone trusted. The violence of the cure became an accepted truth, one more reminder that the body was fragile, and the world indifferent. This brutal extraction reveals how Tudor healing demanded more agony than relief. Yet deeper in these dim rooms lie tools that reach even farther into the body's quiet vulnerabilities. Ahead in the deepening dark waits a method that opens more than wounds when it begins its work. Hand-turned iron rested on the healer's table with a stillness that felt heavier than its weight. Its spiral tip, darkened by age and repeated use, pointed upward like a question no patient wished to answer. The wooden handle, worn smooth by countless rotations, carried the faint smell of sweat and damp cloth. Nothing about the instrument suggested precision. Nothing suggested safety. It was a tool built to breach the skull, and it waited in the dimness, like something half forgotten by mercy. Patients brought to the chamber for this procedure rarely understood what would happen. They came in states of confusion, fear, or despair, conditions the healer interpreted as disturbance of the mind. There were no gentle approaches, no attempts to soothe the unrest. The solution, as believed then, lay beneath the bone. If madness came from pressure, from imbalance, from spirits trapped within, then the skull must be open to let them out. This was the guiding thought behind the drill, a belief held with unnerving certainty. When the healer lifted the tool, the room shifted into a thick hush. Assistants steadied the patient, pressing their hands against trembling shoulders and wrists. Restraint was often necessary, not out of cruelty, but because instinct recoiled from what was about to unfold. The patient looked up at the descending drill, their breath tightening as fear rose into their throat. Any movement was countered with firmer hands. The healer positioned the spiral tip against the scalp, parting hair with little care, marking the point where bone would soon be exposed. The first rotation produced a sound that unsettled even those accustomed to suffering. A slow, grinding twist that echoed inside the chamber like an imitation of machinery. The drill turned not with elegance but with effort. Each rotation pushed the metal deeper through skin, then through the thin membrane beneath, until it met the hard resistance of bone. Pain erupted instantly, sharp and penetrating, moving inward rather than outward. The body struggled beneath the grip of the assistants, muscles tightening as though every nerve had suddenly awakened. The grinding against bone was worse. The sound resonated through the patient's skull, vibrating along the jaw and behind the eyes. It blurred vision, distorted hearing, and made the world tremble in sickening pulses. Blood travelled down the temple in slow, warm lines, dripping onto the healer's hand. Sweat mixed with it, forming a thin sheen across the patient's face. The healer continued to turn the handle, steady and unhurried, listening only to the change in resistance. As the drill began to cut deeper into the bone, there was no cleanliness in the process. No cloth sterilized the skin. No water washed away fragments of bone. The drill moved through layers that should never have been opened, gathering debris along its grooves. The wound widened with each turn, and infection waited like a shadow settling into the exposed edges. The healer acknowledged none of this. They believed the opening itself was the cure, that allowing air or light or spirits to escape would bring clarity to the patient's mind. Understanding of infection lay centuries away. When the drill finally broke through the skull, there was a sudden release, an unsettling drop in resistance that made the healer pause only for a heartbeat. The patient often fell silent at this moment, not from relief, but from the shock that rippled through their senses. Sometimes consciousness slipped away, folding into darkness. Other times, the patient continued trembling, eyes glassy and unfocused, breaths short and uneven. The healer cleaned nothing. They simply withdrew the drill, leaving the small circular wound open as proof that the procedure had succeeded. Families outside clung to hope, believing the opening in the skull might free their loved one from torment. Some patients did improve, though whether from the procedure or from the body's desperate attempt to survive was uncertain. Many, however, worsened. Fever set in. Confusion deepened. Infection entered quietly, travelling inward until it reached places beyond help. When death came, it came with a chilling swiftness, and the healer claimed the mind had simply been too far gone. The drill returned to its place on the table. Still dusted with particles of skin and bone, it received no cleansing, no examination, no reconsideration. Its purpose remained unchanged: The chamber absorbed the echoes of its use, tucking them into the shadows where other screams had already settled. The tool's existence revealed a truth Tudor medicine rarely confronted, that healing and harm often came wrapped in the same motion. To imagine this procedure now is to picture a world where the skull, home to thought, memory, and self, was treated as a sealed vessel that needed piercing. The fragility of life was never more apparent than when iron carved its way through bone, guided by belief rather than knowledge. This violent intrusion reveals how Tudor healers mistook penetration of the skull for restoration of the mind. Yet deeper in these dim rooms rest tools that steal blood faster than thought itself. In the gathering quiet ahead waits another instrument, whose path leads the body toward danger long before help arrives. Iron, glass, and sharpened steel lay arranged on the healer's table, with a precision that made the tools appear more suited for interrogation than treatment. A straight razor with a worn handle, a shallow bowl meant to catch whatever drained from the body, and hollow metal tubes darkened by years of use. Each object carried a coldness that spoke of repetition rather than healing. The belief guiding these instruments was simple and absolute: sickness lived in the blood, and the only path to recovery was to let that blood escape. Patients entered the chamber with a quiet fear that rarely showed on their faces, but always settled in their posture. Shoulders drawn inward, breaths measured, eyes shifting between the tools and the healer. Some came willingly, convinced that bad blood weighed them down like a stone hidden beneath the skin. Others were brought in by family, too weak to walk, too fevered to resist. No matter how they arrived, the outcome depended less on illness than on how much blood the body could lose before surrendering. The razor made its first appearance almost casually, as if it were nothing more than a grooming tool. But in the healer's hands, it transformed into an edge meant to open veins. The blade was rarely cleaned beyond a quick wipe across a sleeve. Rust clung to its surface. Dried flecks from previous patients dotted its edge. Yet no one questioned it. The healer believed the body held more blood than it needed, and illness settled where stagnation began. To release that stagnation, the skin had to part. When the blade touched flesh, it did so with a swift, practiced motion. Pain flared only for a moment before being swallowed by the warmth of rushing blood. The patient often gasped, less from the cut than from the sudden shift inside their body. A draining sensation that made the world tilt slightly. Blood flowed freely into the waiting bowl, splattering against its sides with a rhythm that felt disturbingly calm. The healer watched the color, the thickness, the speed. These details shaped their judgment far more than the patient's expression ever did. Some patients grew pale almost immediately, their lips losing color as dizziness crept upward through their skulls. Others tried to speak, only for their words to vanish under the rising pressure in their ears. Assistants remained close, ready to steady those who swayed or slipped down the chair. Yet restraint was rare. The procedure demanded stillness and weakness. Ironically, often provided exactly that. Blood continued to fall into the bowl until the healer decided enough had been taken, or until the patient collapsed. The metal tubes served another purpose. If a vein refused to yield easily, or if the healer believed deeper stagnation remained, the tube was pressed against the cut to widen the opening, allowing blood to pour more rapidly. This part of the procedure left many trembling, their breaths shallow, their vision narrowing to a thin strip of fading light. No one asked how much blood was safe to lose. No one knew. The belief that sickness lived in the blood overshadowed any sense of caution. A patient already weakened by fever or infection often reached their limit before the healer noticed. Their hands grew cold, their head rolled to one side, their pulse thinned into something barely present. Some died quietly, slipping into unconsciousness that did not lift. Families outside were told the illness had taken them suddenly, that the procedure had simply come too late. In truth, the body had been emptied beyond recovery, drained under the guise of a remedy. Those who survived left the chamber unsteady, clutching their arms as if trying to hold themselves together. The wound was wrapped loosely with cloth, though blood often seeped through long before they reached home. Headaches, chills, and lingering weakness followed for days, sometimes weeks. A few recovered with renewed strength, reinforcing the healer's conviction. Many did not, fading in small rooms where air felt too thin, and the world seemed too heavy to rise into again. The chamber itself bore the history of every bloodletting. Floors stained dark where bowls had spilled. Walls marked faintly where droplets had struck during hurried procedures. The air carried the metallic scent of iron mixed with herbs intended to mask the severity of the act. Patients pretended not to notice. Fear taught them silence. Tradition taught them acceptance. To imagine such a scene now is to face a world where draining life from the body was considered an act of restoration, where the sight of blood leaving the veins meant hope rather than alarm. Yet this belief governed Tudor medicine with unshakable confidence. The healer trusted the bowl more than the pulse, the quantity more than the body's own warnings. This draining ritual reveals how Tudor healers mistook weakness for progress in the pursuit of balance. Yet, deeper within these shadowed rooms lie tools that restrain even when the body begs for release. Ahead, through the thickening gloom, waits a method that binds flesh long before any wound is tended. A band of cold metal lay on the healer's table, with a kind of stillness that suggested intent rather than neutrality. Its curved frame was shaped to follow the outline of a torso. Yet there was nothing gentle in its design. The edges were rigid, the hinges heavy, and the mechanism for tightening sat like a clenched fist, waiting to close. This device was not meant for precision or comfort. It existed to confine, to compress, and to discipline the body of any woman judged to have lost control of her mind. Women brought into the chamber often carried exhaustion more than fear, even though fear eventually settled once they understood why they had been summoned. Their symptoms: restlessness, sleeplessness, grief, and anger were all gathered under one word. The era wielded without hesitation: hysteria. It was a diagnosis that needed no proof. Once spoken, it justified whatever came next. The healer approached with calm authority, as though the band's purpose required no explanation. Assistants guided the woman toward the wooden chair, their movements practiced, their faces unreadable. The chamber air felt thick, holding the weight of past treatments. When the band opened, its hinges made a sound that echoed faintly, a metallic whisper that cut through the silence. The woman's breath shortened even before the metal touched her skin. The band wrapped around her midsection with a chill that stole warmth from her body. At first, it rested lightly, like an unwelcome hand. Then the tightening began, a slow, unyielding pressure that pushed inward, compressing flesh and bone without regard for the body's natural boundaries. Each turn of the screw narrowed the space within her torso, restricting movement, limiting breath, and forcing her posture into rigid stillness. Her hands gripped the sides of the chair, fingers trembling as she fought instinctive resistance. But resistance had no place here. The assistants held her steady while the healer continued adjusting the device. Breaths became small and quick, fragments of what they should have been. Pain radiated across her ribs and abdomen, not sharp, but crushing. A constant internal weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. The healer watched closely. Not the woman's distress, but the level of compression. They believed that pressure corrected imbalance, that forcing the body into submission would calm the mind. Every shallow breath was interpreted as a sign of progress. Some women fainted under the pressure, their bodies folding inward as consciousness slipped away. Others sat rigid and silent, their eyes wide and unfocused, enduring the slow suffocation without collapse. The chamber accepted both outcomes, neither prompting concern. The goal was not comfort. The goal was compliance. The band remained tightened for as long as the healer deemed necessary. Minutes felt like hours as the woman wrestled with the crushing sensation. When the device was finally loosened, relief did not arrive gently. The sudden expansion of her chest brought pain as sharp as the initial constriction. Muscles spasmed, air rushed in too quickly, and dizziness blurred the world around her. Some gasped, others cried quietly. But the healer marked the session a success if the woman seemed quieter than before. Bruises often formed along the abdomen, deepening into dark patches that lingered for days. Internal discomfort persisted long after the session ended. Pain when breathing, stiffness when moving, and weakness that disrupted even simple tasks. Yet none of this was seen as harm. These were considered signs that the treatment had exerted its intended influence. The woman's suffering was recast as evidence of healing, a distortion accepted by both healer and family. No one questioned the logic behind such a method. Women were expected to endure, to submit to whatever restraint promised to restore order. Their voices carried little weight, and their discomfort even less. The band's true function became clear, not through its design, but through its effects. It subdued. It silenced. It transformed emotional distress into physical obedience. To observe such a scene now is to witness a world where psychological struggle met with bodily punishment, where the healer's certainty overshadowed the woman's humanity. The band represented a belief that control equaled cure, and that compressing the body could somehow quiet the mind. It revealed a cold truth about the era. Treatment and restraint were often indistinguishable. This tightening device reveals how Tudor healers confused obedience with recovery. Yet the deeper truth behind these practices points toward a pattern far larger than a single tool. Rising from that pattern is a reality in which women became the chosen subjects for experiments they never agreed to. Shadows in the Tudor healing chamber often revealed a truth few dared to name. The women who entered were not simply patients, but bodies chosen for experiments disguised as remedies. They arrived carrying fears, questions, or pains that should have called for comfort. Yet the healer's gaze interpreted these signs through a harsher lens. A tremor in the voice, a moment of grief, a restless night. Each was treated as evidence of instability. Once labelled weak, a woman became the perfect subject for procedures no man would accept, tools no man would tolerate, and justifications no man would challenge. The atmosphere inside such rooms carried a quiet certainty that these treatments were necessary, even righteous. Healers believed that women's bodies were prone to disorder, that their emotions rose too quickly, that their thoughts wandered in ways the era could not explain. This belief permitted iron to be tightened around their waists, for needles to be pressed into their skin, for blood to be drawn without question. The chamber became a place where suffering was not only permitted but expected, because those who endured it were assumed incapable of understanding what helped them. Women rarely spoke when the healer approached. Silence was not consent, it was survival. Any hesitation could be interpreted as another symptom. Any question could be used against them. A woman who resisted a device might be described as agitated. One who trembles might be called hysterical. One who cried out in fear might be accused of lacking discipline. At every turn, the healer's interpretation outweighed her experience, shaping the narrative until she lost the right to define her own distress. The tools used on women often differed from those used on men. Men received treatments aimed at restoring strength. Women received instruments designed to restrict, suppress, or correct. Iron bands compressed their bodies. Restraints held them still for imagined disorders. Devices meant to balance inner disturbances pressed against their ribs or abdomen until the body could no longer distinguish healing from punishment. These tools were presented not as acts of force, but of necessity. The quiet violence of the chamber was softened only by the healer's calm voice explaining that everything was for her own good. Families reinforced these beliefs, bringing women to healers out of fear, frustration, or misunderstanding. A woman who felt overwhelmed by grief might be told she needed discipline. One who struggled with exhaustion might be told her emotions required confinement. Even dreams could be used as evidence. The healer, seeing confirmation in every fragile detail, applied treatments with solemn conviction, convinced the body needed to be corrected rather than understood. Inside the chamber, the woman's world narrowed. The walls closed in around her. Tools clinked softly as they were arranged. Assistants stood near, their hands ready to restrain rather than support. When metal touched skin, the shock often stole her breath. When pressure built, her voice faltered. When pain rose, she learned quickly that any cry could be interpreted as further proof of imbalance. The entire structure of the treatment created a trap. The more she reacted, the more she justified the healer's diagnosis. Some women fainted during procedures, slipping into temporary darkness that brought neither relief nor escape. Others endured in rigid stillness, eyes unfocused, breaths shallow. The healer interpreted both reactions as signs of progress, never as indications of harm. Days later, when pain lingered or weakness deepened, women were told this was simply the body adjusting. If they protested, the healer attributed their distress to the very illness they had come to treat. A loop formed around them, one they could neither break nor name. Their confusion validated the treatment. Their fear justified restraint. Their suffering proved the healer's methods were reaching the source of the trouble. No outcome, no matter how cruel, casts doubt on the tool. Doubt fell only upon the women themselves. Outside the chamber, life continued as if nothing had happened. Women returned to households expecting them to cook, clean, care for children, or remain quiet beside men who never questioned what had been done in the name of health. Their bruises were hidden beneath clothing. Their exhaustion was dismissed as fragility. Their pain was considered natural. And when another woman showed signs of distress, she too was brought to the healer, completing the cycle. To witness such an era from afar is to see how easily authority masks itself as compassion, how effortlessly a diagnosis can become a sentence, and how swiftly a belief can silence those who suffer under it. These tools did not merely treat the body, they controlled it. They pressed discipline into flesh, shaping behavior more than healing illness. Women became subjects not because they were sick, but because the system decided they were. This quiet coercion reveals how Tudor medicine turned women into proving grounds for its harshest ideas. Yet deeper in these hidden rooms emerges a tool meant to reach places no healer should have touched. Through the tightening shadows comes a method that pierces the body in search of order, but it never finds. Metal rested on the healer's table in the shape of long, narrow needles. Though calling them needles was generous, their shafts were thick, their tips closer to miniature spearheads than instruments of care. Each one carried a faint discoloration from repeated use, a dull sheen that caught the dim light of the chamber. Nothing about them suggested precision or restraint. They were tools made for penetration, not healing, and their purpose reached deeper than the skin ever should. Patients brought for this treatment often suffered stomach pain, cramping, or digestive distress, symptoms common in a world of spoiled food, contaminated water, and unrelenting labour. But in Tudor belief, discomfort within the abdomen was not a matter of infection or nourishment. Instead, it signalled imbalance, stagnation, or a blocked humour that needed freeing. The healer approached these complaints with a certainty born of tradition, not evidence, and the needles were their chosen answer. The chamber fell silent as the healer lifted the first needle, its weight surprising for something meant to enter the body. The patient watched with a tightening breath. sensing that what was about to happen required neither gentle touch nor careful aim. The healer pressed fingers into the abdomen, searching for a place where the skin felt tense or tender. Once found, they marked the spot not with ink or charcoal, but with the pressure of their thumb. A fleeting imprint of intention. When the tip touched the skin, the initial discomfort felt manageable. But the moment the healer pushed deeper, the world shifted sharply. Pain erupted not outward, but inward, radiating along paths the patient had never felt before. The needle did not glide, it forced. It pressed through layers of muscle, seeking depth with a determination shaped by belief rather than knowledge. The body recoiled, but assistants held the patient steady, their grip firm and unyielding. Breath fractured into stuttering fragments as the needle travelled farther. A sharp heat spread through the abdomen, mingling with a twisting ache that made thought impossible. The healer watched carefully, not to monitor harm, but to evaluate how much resistance remained. They believed the needle needed to reach the organ itself. The liver, the intestine, and the stomach lining, where imagined blockages could be released. Any hesitation from the patient was dismissed as natural discomfort. Any cry was treated as proof that the needle was reaching the source of the ailment. Once the needle reached its intended depth, the healer left it there, protruding from the skin like a misplaced weapon. The patient trembled as the foreign object pulsed with their heartbeat, sending sharp waves through the abdomen. The healer might insert a second needle nearby, repeating the process with the same unwavering confidence. Sometimes 3 or 4 needles were used, depending on how severe the healer believed the imbalance to be. Internal injury was not a concern. Bruising, punctures, and bleeding inside the abdomen were considered ordinary outcomes. If a patient collapsed or fainted, the healer interpreted it as a sign that the illness was releasing its hold. If fever followed, it was blamed on the body's attempt to rebalance itself. The idea that the needle had torn something vital, an artery, a section of bowel, the liver's fragile surface, rarely crossed their mind. And if it did, it was dismissed as an unavoidable risk. Many patients left the chamber, doubling over in pain, their steps unsteady, their breathing shallow. At home, they experienced worsening symptoms, vomiting, fever, rigidity in the abdomen, or a slow, creeping weakness that stole strength from the limbs. Some improved briefly, their pain dulled by the body's shock. Others worsened rapidly, slipping into illness that spread through the organs with quiet, lethal speed. When they died, the healer spoke confidently of corruption too deep to cure. The tools themselves bore silent testimony to what they caused. Their tips grew duller with use, their shafts stained with remnants of tissue no cloth could fully remove. Yet they were rarely cleaned beyond a quick wipe. Metal passed from one patient to the next, carrying along whatever hidden threats the previous body had released. Belief in the treatment overshadowed caution, and the absence of standards left the healer unquestioned. To witness such a procedure now is to see a world where intrusion was mistaken for remedy, where the depths of the body were opened, not by necessity, but by misguided conviction. The needles revealed a truth Tudor healing struggled to recognize, that harm done with confidence can travel farther than any illness. The chamber absorbed every quiet cry, every tightening breath, every tremor beneath the healer's hands, binding them into the history of a practice that reached far too deep. This invasive practice shows how Tudor medicine sought answers in the body's depths without understanding the dangers it unleashed. Yet within these dim surroundings waits another tool built to clamp and crush rather than pierce. Out of the deepening quiet comes a device that reshapes the face in its attempt to restore order. A small clamp of copper or iron lay on the healer's table, its shape deceptively simple. 2 curved arms joined by a stiff hinge. The tips flattened into narrow pads, meant to press together with unwavering force. Its dull surface showed scratches from repeated use, and the faint scent of metal lingered in the air around it. Nothing about the tool suggested care or delicacy. It was built for pressure, for restraint, for closing off a part of the face that should never have known such weight. To the healer, it was a remedy. To the patient, it was an intrusion that left marks long after the bleeding stopped. Patients arriving with nosebleeds came with small towels pressed to their faces. Embarrassed, more than afraid. A simple inconvenience. They believed something a cloth or cold water might soothe. But in Tudor medicine, any sign of unchecked bleeding triggered alarm. Blood belonged inside the body, not out. The healer approached with a seriousness that far exceeded the condition, lifting the clamp with a steadiness that made the patient's skin tighten. What awaited them was never explained. Explanation was a luxury, and fear was considered unnecessary. The clamp felt cold even before it touched the skin. Once positioned at the base of the nose, the healer applied pressure to close the metal arms around the nostrils. The first squeeze brought discomfort, sharp and sudden. As bone and cartilage pressed inward, breathing through the nose became impossible. Air shifted upward in a desperate pull. Silent protest, and the patient was forced to inhale shallowly through the mouth. The clamp held firm, refusing to acknowledge the body's attempt to adapt. As minutes passed, the pressure deepened into something harsher. The nostrils swelled around the metal pads, the skin reddening beneath the clamp's grip. Pain radiated upward along the bridge of the nose and outward toward the eyes. Tears gathered involuntarily, blurring vision even when the patient tried to remain still. The chamber's air grew thick, each breath shallow and uneven as the body struggled to adjust to the unnatural constriction. Yet the healer observed calmly, convinced that the force applied was both appropriate and necessary. The clamp did not merely halt the bleeding, it punished the tissue it touched. The longer it stayed, the more the cartilage compressed, flattening under the relentless pressure. Some patients tried to lift a hand in protest, but assistants blocked the gesture with quiet efficiency. Any sign of distress was dismissed as impatience. The healer believed that time was essential, that the blood vessels needed prolonged suppression to prevent recurrence. They never considered that the clamp itself caused new wounds. Embrouilles, or ruptures, or torn cartilage that would take far longer to heal than a simple nosebleed. When the clamp was finally removed, the release came with a sharp sting as blood rushed back into the compressed flesh. The nostrils throbbed violently, swelling almost instantly. The patient touched their nose with tentative fingers, feeling the heat and tenderness spreading across the center of their face. In some cases, the clamp left deep indentations that took days to fade. In others, the damage was permanent. A crooked bridge, a collapsed nostril, or a subtle asymmetry that would remain visible for life. The healer rarely noticed these changes, or if they did, they attributed them to the patient's condition rather than the treatment. Children suffered the most. Their smaller faces offered less resistance to the clamp, and the delicate cartilage bent more easily under pressure. They cried as the tool closed around them. Though crying only worsened the pain, their tears pooled at the corners of their eyes, dripping silently, while the healer insisted they stay still. Some fainted from the discomfort, others trembled until their limbs went numb. When they left the chamber, their noses remained swollen for days, and the memory of the clamp haunted them far longer. The chamber bore traces of these procedures: stains on cloths, reddish smudges on the healer's apron, faint marks on the wooden table where patients had gripped hard to endure the pain. The clamp itself grew no cleaner with time. The metal pads retained discoloration from dried blood, and the hinge stiffened from neglect. Yet none of this diminished its use. Tradition held strong, and tradition convinced the healer that the clamp was indispensable. To witness such a practice now is to see a world where simplicity justified brutality, where a minor inconvenience became grounds for severe intervention, and where the healer's confidence overshadowed the patient's suffering. The clamp revealed a deeper truth about Tudor medicine, that stopping blood mattered more than preserving the body it flowed from. This painful restraint shows how Tudor healers mistook compression for control. Yet within this darkened chamber waits another tool designed to invade the body's most vulnerable passages. From the deepening stillness comes a method that reaches inward with far greater violence than its purpose suggests. A long metal tube rested on the healer's table, its surface dull and uneven, as if shaped more by force than craftsmanship. It stretched out like a narrow passageway leading into darkness, cold to the touch and heavy enough to demand 2 hands for steady control. The opening at its tip was not smooth. The edges bore small imperfections. Nicks, scratches, and slight bends that revealed how often the instrument had been used without care. Nothing about it suggested healing. It looked instead like a tool built to breach the body, to enter places never meant for metal. Patients brought to the chamber for this procedure came with complaints of bloating, constipation, or discomfort, conditions that, in a healthier world, required simple rest or better nourishment. But in Tudor medicine, digestive distress was interpreted through the lens of imbalance and impurity. The healer believed the body accumulated harmful substances that needed to be expelled, and the tube was the chosen method to force that expulsion. There was no discussion of alternatives. The instrument itself was the argument. The patient was guided to lie on their side, knees drawn upward, not by choice but by instruction. The position left them exposed, vulnerable, in a way that stripped away dignity before the procedure even began. The chamber felt colder in this posture, its air heavy with the scent of metal and damp cloth. The healer lifted the tube, inspecting it briefly with a nod that suggested confidence rather than consideration. No cloth was dipped in oil. No water was warmed. Lubrication was not part of the practice. Sterilization was unheard of. The tube entered as it existed, bare, cold, and unclean. When the metal first touched the skin, the patient's body tightened instinctively. The chill of the tube traveled upward through their spine, a warning, unspoken but unmistakable. Then came the pressure, a firm push that caused the muscles to seize in resistance. Pain fled sharply as the tube forced its way past the body's natural boundaries. The healer urged relaxation. Though the command felt absurd, nothing in the moment allowed for ease. The body's instinct was to close, to retreat from intrusion. But retreat was impossible. The tube advanced. The deeper it went, the worse the pain became. It was not a surface pain, but a tearing, stretching agony that radiated inward, echoing through the abdomen. Some patients cried out, their voices cracking under the strain. Others gritted their teeth, their breaths short and uneven. Assistants held them steady, pressing shoulders or hips to keep the body from shifting. The healer watched for signs of resistance only to push harder, convinced that discomfort signaled the release of impurities rather than the onset of injury. Internal damage occurred with alarming ease. The tube scraped delicate tissue, opening small wounds that bled unseen. In some cases, it tore the rectal wall, sending searing pain through the entire lower body. The healer rarely noticed. They believed resistance came from blockage, not harm. The tube continued its path, widening the passage with every forced movement. When the patient began shaking uncontrollably, the healer interpreted it as strain from the purging process, never as a sign of shock. Once the tube reached its intended depth, it was left in place while pressure inside the abdomen built to something unbearable. Some healers blew air into the tube, believing it stimulated movement within the gut. This action caused sharp spasms that left the patient gasping. Others simply waited, insisting the body would release toxins in time. But often, nothing happened. Nothing except rising, pulsing pain, and the growing risk of infection. When the tube was finally removed, it dragged against a body already injured. The sudden shift of pressure caused dizziness, nausea, or fainting. Patients lay trembling, curling inward, clutching their abdomen as though trying to keep something from spilling out. Blood sometimes followed, bright against the chamber floor. Though the healer dismissed it as normal, they warned the patient of continued soreness, as if soreness were the limit of what the body had endured. In the days that followed, many patients developed fever, chills, and deep abdominal pain. Infections spread silently through torn tissue, filling the body with heat and weakness. Some grew rigid with agony, unable to stand. Others slipped in and out of consciousness, their breaths shallow as the infection reached deeper organs. Death often arrived quietly, mistaken for the natural progression of illness rather than the direct consequence of the tube. Families mourned without answers, believing the healer had done everything possible. The chamber, indifferent to these outcomes, remained ready for the next patient. The tube was wiped with a cloth, nothing more, and placed back among the other tools. It carried particles from previous bodies, traces of infection, echoes of pain. But tradition held firm, and tradition had no interest in reconsideration. The healer believed in the tube, and belief alone was enough to justify its continued use. To view such a practice from afar is to see how ignorance cloaked itself in confidence, how intrusion became a remedy, and how the body's most vulnerable places were treated with brutal disregard. The tube embodied the era's greatest misunderstanding, that forcing the body open could somehow restore balance. Instead, it revealed how easily harm masqueraded as healing, leaving behind wounds unseen and stories untold. This violent intrusion reveals how Tudor healers mistook invasion for cleansing. Yet within these same chambers rests another device meant not to open the body but to shock it into compliance. From the dimming stillness emerges a method that plunges flesh into extremes it was never meant to endure. Two basins stood at opposite ends of the chamber, one filled with water so cold it smoked in the air, the other steaming as though drawn from beneath the earth. They were placed with deliberate symmetry, mirrors of opposing temperatures meant to represent the balance Tudor healers believed the body lacked. The idea was simple in theory, yet brutal in practice. Submerge a patient in one extreme, then thrust them into the other, forcing the body to reset its internal humours. No tool in the room cut or pierced. Yet the suffering these basins caused rivaled any blade. Patients arrived shivering even before the procedure began, not from cold, but from the uncertainty that clung to the air. The healer spoke of imbalance, of fluids within the body, rising or sinking where they should not. Words came calmly, shaped by confidence rather than understanding. The patient listened because there was nothing else to do. Illness left them desperate. Custom left them obedient. They stood beside the cold basin, breath unsteady, watching their reflection ripple across the icy surface. The healer gave the signal. An assistant lowered the patient into the water. The shock struck instantly. Cold tore through the skin like knives, gripping muscles until the entire body stiffened in panic. Breathing fractured into shallow gasps as the chest seized. The heart pounded wildly, unsure whether to slow or race. The water swallowed every inch of flesh, its chill numbing the outer layers while sending violent tremors through the core. The patient's fingers clawed at the basin's edge, slipping each time the cold stole strength from their grip. The healer watched carefully, not with worry, but with calculation. When the trembling grew uncontrollable, when the lips turned blue, or breath stuttered dangerously, the patient was dragged from the cold and rushed across the chamber. Steam rose around them as they approached the hot basin, the sudden warmth giving a false promise of relief. But the body, still in shock, met the heat, not with comfort, but with confusion. Muscles spasmed, blood vessels dilated too quickly, and dizziness struck with crushing force. As the patient entered the steaming water, the heat wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. Skin burned from the contrast, reddening instantly. The heart, moments earlier strained by cold, now thrashed in response to the sudden rise in temperature. Breath thickened in the throat as the steam filled the lungs. The patient felt suspended between freezing and burning, unable to adapt to either. Trapped in a pendulum of extremes, controlled entirely by the healer's belief in balance. When the healer judged the time sufficient, the cycle repeated. Back to the cold, then back to the heat. Again and again. Each transition struck the body harder than the last. The patient's limbs grew heavy. Their voice fell silent. Their pulse fluttered beneath the skin in irregular patterns. The world narrowed into the violent swings of temperature, the mind slipping between clarity and fog as the body struggled to survive what it could not understand. Some fainted during the procedure, their heads falling against the basin's edge or sinking toward the water until an assistant intervened. Others remained conscious, only to feel the frightening shift of their heartbeat. Too fast, then too weak, then erratic. The healer interpreted fainting as proof that the treatment was reaching the system deeply. They believed collapse meant progress. No one questioned whether the body was simply failing. Many patients left the chamber barely able to stand. Their skin burned and chilled in alternating patches, their hearts racing unevenly. Later that evening, or days after, they found themselves gripped by exhaustion, fever, or a strange heaviness in the chest. Some recovered slowly. Some worsened without explanation. Others died quietly, their bodies too fragile to withstand the assault of extremes. Families mourned, never imagining that water, something so ordinary, had delivered such harm. The basins waited afterward in the same stillness with which they had begun. The cold one continued to smoke faintly, the hot one steaming gently, as if unaware of what they had drawn from the patient's strength. The chamber smelled of damp cloth, heated stone, and the metallic tang of fear. Assistants emptied and refilled the basins with a detached rhythm, preparing for whoever came next. No evidence supported the treatment's effectiveness. There was no change in the imbalance of humours, no shift in the conditions the healer claimed to correct. But belief held firm, rooted in tradition rather than observation. Patients often returned because the healer insisted the treatment required multiple cycles. Their trust was shaped by desperation, and their desperation made them vulnerable to methods that harmed far more than they healed. To observe such a practice now is to see how easily conviction becomes cruelty, how a technique meant to restore balance instead dragged the body closer to collapse. The basins revealed a profound misunderstanding of the body's limits, an ignorance masked by ritual, repeated until suffering became indistinguishable from remedy. This punishing cycle shows how Tudor healers mistook shock for restoration. Yet beneath these same dim rafters waits another device meant not to shift temperature, but to summon dread before touch is even made. Behind its motionless shape grew a fear so deep that many chose suffering at home rather than risk the healer's hand. Many Tudor patients stepped toward the healer's doorway already defeated, their bodies trembling long before a hand ever reached for them. They had seen too many survive a fever, only to be broken by the tools meant to cure it. Too many collapse not from illness, but from the agony inflicted in its name. To them, healing no longer resembled hope. It resembled a hallway walked toward punishment, a place where the body braced for harm disguised as care. Nothing inside those rooms promised comfort. Everything promised endurance. That was the quiet truth everyone learned eventually. In those dim interiors, fear was not an emotion that rose suddenly. It grew slowly, tightening through the ribs each time a latch clicked or a drawer slid open. A patient sitting on the edge of a wooden bench could feel their breath thin at the mere sound of metal shifting. The healer might stand calmly, adjusting the angle of a blade or the weight of a clamp. But the patient watched each movement with the certainty that pain, not healing, was about to enter their bloodstream. It was common for someone to faint before the procedure even began, not from weakness of body, but from clarity of memory. People spoke softly about the tools because speaking loudly made them feel too real. A woman who had lost a brother on a simple visit for stomach pain would whisper that his cries lingered in her dreams. A man who had watched blood run across a table during a tooth extraction would lower his gaze whenever someone mentioned illness, as if even the word threatened to drag him back to that room. These were not exaggerations. These were the remnants of a world where healing demanded more suffering than disease ever had. Some patients refused treatment entirely. They stayed in their homes, wrapped themselves in blankets, and accepted whatever fate followed, not because they wished to die, but because the alternative was to surrender their bodies to hands that cut, crushed, pierced, and drained with little pause for mercy. Many believed that dying in their own beds meant retaining some fragment of dignity. Dying on the healer's bench meant losing even the shape of their last breath. Even those who survived carried the memory like a bruise beneath the skin. A man who had his arm stitched without sedation might wake for years with the echo of the needle pressing into him. Each remembered sting reshaping the night. A woman who endured a cauterization would touch the scar on her abdomen every morning, not to monitor healing, but to remind herself that she had once been strapped down and silenced while smoke rose from her own flesh. Such memories did not fade. They settled into the mind as quietly as dust, then stayed. Healers insisted their intentions were pure. They claimed the procedures were necessary, the agony tolerable, the screams an understandable but irrelevant side effect. They spoke as though fear belonged to the patient, not the craft. Yet their own movements often betrayed them. Some hesitated when lifting a tool. Some swallowed hard before beginning. Some avoided eye contact, unable to look directly at the person whose body they were about to break in the name of balance, correction, or restoration. Their silence was not confidence. It was resignation. Fear was the true currency of Tudor medicine. It passed between healer and patient with every scrape of metal, every torn cloth, every moment spent immobilized under the weight of another's judgment. The tools themselves carried the memory of countless bodies. They did not reflect light. They absorbed it, darkening with each use until the air around them felt thick with unspoken history. Patients sensed this the moment they entered the room. A family might gather outside, waiting to hear if the healer's work had saved their loved one. But even they understood that survival depended less on the illness and more on the body's ability to endure the violence that followed. Many times, the door opened not to news of recovery, but to an apology shaped as an explanation. The illness was too strong, the healer might say. Yet the family saw the stains on the table, the tremor in the healer's hand, the silence left behind. They knew better. In that world, fear guided every decision. It dictated who sought treatment and who hid. It decided who lived long enough to tell their story and who vanished quietly after one final scream behind a closed door. Illness was unpredictable, but the healer's tools were not. They promised suffering, and they kept that promise with unwavering precision. That is why so many people chose pain at home instead of salvation under metal. They preferred wounds inflicted by nature to wounds delivered by design. This lingering terror shows how Tudor healing demanded the body's surrender long before the illness ever did. Yet deeper within this dark lineage waits another device, one built to take rather than mend. What it removed left not just scars, but an absence no one dared name aloud. There were moments in Tudor medicine when the body was not treated as something to heal, but as something to remove piece by piece whenever fear or uncertainty demanded it. A swelling that refused to fade, a lump that caused suspicion, a bruise that held the wrong color for too long. Any of these could brand a patient as someone whose flesh needed to be taken away entirely. No examination confirmed the danger. No test determined whether the growth meant life or death. The healer saw a mark and decided cutting was the only path forward. Those decisions were carried out with a tool that resembled the blade used in slaughterhouses. Long and curved, heavy enough to part thick tissue with one strong pull. The room where such procedures occurred never pretended to offer comfort. A patient stood or lay stiffly, hands trembling against a rough wooden surface, while the healer readied the blade with a calmness that made the moment even more frightening. There were no gentle words to prepare the patient, no explanation that spoke of hope, just the mechanical adjustments of a tool meant for taking, not saving. The air inside the room felt thick, as if even the walls braced themselves for what the blade would demand. For those facing removal of the breast, the fear began the moment the gown slipped from the shoulder, and the exposed skin met the cold air. The healer marked nothing. He measured nothing. He simply positioned his hand with frightening certainty, as though the body before him were a map he had memorized decades ago. The curve of the blade glinted without hesitation. When it met flesh, there was no pause, only a sharp, decisive cut meant to separate the body from whatever the healer believed threatened it. A single motion could change the shape of a person forever. The process for men was no less brutal. A man brought in with swelling or pain in the groin knew the outcome before anyone spoke. Those who had watched others undergo the procedure often arrived pale, resigned, unable to lift their eyes. They were instructed to sit still, to hold their breath, to keep their legs from shaking. No one could truly obey. The blade moved quickly, slicing through one of the most vulnerable parts of the human body in a way that left both the room and the patient filled with a silence that felt heavier than screams. Few forgot that moment for the rest of their lives, if they lived long enough to remember it at all. Survival was a question the healer rarely addressed. The body bled freely after such removals, and whatever cloth was pressed against the wound often soaked through within minutes. Infection followed as reliably as night. Some patients staggered home afterward, clutching their bandages with a distant stare, hoping to hold on until morning. Others never made it past the threshold. Those who did survive carried scars that shifted the way they stood, the way they dressed, the way they existed. Their bodies were altered not by illness, but by the hand that claimed to fight it. Healers believed they were protecting the patient from something greater. They argued that leaving the growth untouched meant allowing decay to take root. Yet they operated without knowledge of what they removed, without understanding whether the tissue posed any threat. The blade acted first. Knowledge, if it ever arrived, came too late. This was not caution. It was fear disguised as certainty. Families reacted in quiet devastation. A mother watching her daughter return home without a breast could not speak. A wife who saw her husband weakened and wounded could only sit beside him, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. They knew the healer's decision had been final long before the blade touched the skin. They also knew they had no voice in the matter. Their only role was to stand outside the room and wait for the shape of their loved one to emerge altered, or not emerge at all. In Village, stories of these removals spread with a mix of horror and resignation. People whispered that the blade was used too quickly, too confidently, too often. Yet, when a swelling appeared on their own bodies, fear pushed them to seek the healer anyway. Illness terrified them. The cure terrified them more. Every choice led toward risk. No choice led toward safety. The tool itself carried the history of those who had faced it. Its edge dulled and sharpened again, stained and cleaned incompletely, passed from hand to hand through generations of practitioners who accepted its role without question. Even outside the healer's room, its silhouette resting on a wooden table could silence an entire household. It did not need to be raised to inflict harm. The memory attached to it was already enough. This was the reality of Tudor medicine, a world where decisions were made quickly, bodies were altered permanently, and the meaning of treatment blurred until it resembled something closer to punishment than care. The blade promised removal, but never certainty. It left wounds both visible and hidden, reshaping not just the body, but the life that followed. This quiet violence shows how easily a healer's certainty could take far more than illness itself. Yet another tool waited in the same shadowed drawer, one that changed bone with a single swing. Its impact was felt long after the sound faded. There was a particular dread that settled over any Tudor patient the moment they learned their bone was out of place. A word like that carried consequences, for it meant the healer would reach not for a bandage or a splint, but for a heavy hammer, an object that looked more suited for shaping iron than touching human flesh. Its wooden handle was worn from years of gripping, and its metal head bore dents that told stories no patient wished to hear. The sight alone could drain colour from a face. Yet the healer lifted it as casually as one might lift a spoon. The process began with inspection, but it was an inspection performed with unsettling indifference. The healer pressed a thumb against the patient's skin, searching for signs only he could interpret. A wince from the patient confirmed everything. Once pain was detected, the decision was made. There was no further questioning, no second opinion, no attempt to understand the injury with precision. To the healer, the body was a stubborn structure that needed force, not delicacy. The hammer rested nearby, waiting for its call. Patients were told to remain still, though everyone knew this was impossible. Fear tightened their muscles long before the first strike. Some clutched the edges of the table. Others pressed their foreheads to the wooden surface, whispering whatever comfort they could muster. They braced themselves, not for something sharp, but for something blunt and unpredictable. The kind of pain that rippled inward and lingered in a way they could not describe. The healer offered no reassurance. His silence was the only warning they received. When the hammer rose, it rose without hesitation. It paused for the briefest breath above the targeted limb, then dropped with a force meant to correct what he believed was misaligned. The sound was heavy, echoing inside the small room like a sudden shift in the world. Sometimes the bone shifted back into place. Often, it did not. The healer, unwilling to accept the failure of the first strike, simply swung again. Sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, until he felt resistance change beneath the skin. Accuracy was not a priority. Strength was. The pain that followed ran deeper than a simple bruise. Patients described a kind of shock that travelled through the entire limb, rattling nerves and leaving behind a numbness that felt almost hollow. Some fainted on the spot. Others cried out until their voices thinned. A few held their breath long enough to feel the world blur at the edges, the room shrinking around them. The healer rarely paused to acknowledge any of this. He considered the suffering an unavoidable part of the process, something to be endured, not relieved. When the strikes went wrong, and they often did, the damage became far more severe than the injury that brought the patient in. Bones that were merely misaligned cracked under the force. Joints that were inflamed became dislocated entirely. Nerves that once carried sensation with precision went silent after the impact. Patients left the room gripping their limbs with shaking hands, trying to convince themselves that the unbearable pain meant healing had begun. Most knew the truth long before the swelling appeared. Something inside them had changed for the worse. Families watched the aftermath with quiet horror. A mother might hold her child's broken arm gently, hoping to soothe what could not be soothed. A husband might help his wife walk home, each step revealing the damage the hammer had caused. They whispered hopes that the pain would fade, that function would return, that the healer's force had done more good than harm. But hope rarely aligned with fate. Many injuries became permanent. Limbs twisted, joints stiffened. Hands that once worked fields or tended hearths could no longer move as they once did. The healer, meanwhile, continued his practice without reflection. The hammer was set aside, cleaned only of visible dirt, and returned to the same place on the shelf. Another patient would eventually come through the door, wincing and afraid, and the cycle would begin again. The tool became an extension of authority, an object that demanded trust, even though it delivered pain with unsettling consistency. Those who questioned it were dismissed. They were told their bodies needed force, that weakness required correction, that the blow was a necessary act. Villagers learned to fear any injury that might bring them to the healer's door. A simple sprain became a threat. A fall from a cart became a gamble. They wrapped their limbs tightly at home, praying the swelling would ease. They waited days before seeking help, hoping nature would mend what man might destroy. Stories of botched hammer strikes travelled quickly, spreading from house to house, until even the youngest children recognized the dreaded tool when they saw it carried from one village to another. Its silhouette alone was enough to make them step back. The hammer itself remained unchanged over time. It did not grow lighter. It did not grow kinder. It carried the marks of every strike. Each dent a reminder of bodies reshaped under its force. In the healer's hand, it represented confidence. In the patient's eyes, it symbolized something far darker. A moment when pain was invited rather than avoided. When the threat of harm outweighed the promise of healing. This was the nature of Tudor medicine, blunt, forceful, and convinced of its own necessity. A misaligned bone might be corrected, but at a terrible cost. A life might continue, but never in the same way. The hammer made decisions permanent. Such heavy certainty reveals how the body became a battleground under the healer's hand. Another restraint waited nearby, one that bound more than limbs when fear turned into resistance. Its knots told their own quiet story. A quiet dread often crept into a Tudor treatment room whenever the ropes were lifted from their hooks. Patients understood instantly what their presence meant. Whatever came next would demand stillness they did not choose. The coils looked rough and unyielding, their fibers hardened by repeated use, shaped by countless hands that had fastened them around countless wrists. They appeared simple, almost ordinary, yet the room seemed to shift the moment they were brought into view. The air tightened. The doorway felt farther away than it had moments earlier. Healers spoke with composed certainty as they justified the ropes. They insisted that patients moved too much, that proper care required complete restraint, that any resistance would make the procedure impossible. But those who had been tied before knew that restraint had little to do with medicine. It served a different purpose, to silence fear by overpowering it, to force compliance when the body's instinct was to flee, to turn the healer's instructions into commands that could not be disobeyed. A patient's hesitation was interpreted as stubbornness. Their trembling was labelled as a worsening illness. By the time the ropes touched the skin, blame had already been assigned. Different bodies were positioned in different ways. Some patients were strapped tightly into wooden chairs, their arms pulled behind them until their shoulders ached. Others lay stretched across long tables, wrists and ankles bound to each corner so they could not curl or recoil. A few stood upright against wooden posts, forced to hold their weight without the ability to bend their knees. The knots tightened with practiced precision. Each one pulled until the rope dug into the flesh. The healer rarely looked at the patient's face during this process. For him, binding was routine. Once secured, the patient's body lost the freedom to follow its instincts. Muscles tensed in unnatural positions. Breath shortened, and the first beads of sweat gathered before any tool was raised. The ropes did not merely restrict movement, they reshaped it. A slight pull became impossible. A small flinch transformed into pain. Those who attempted to speak found their own voice betraying them, trembling at the edges, breaking mid-sentence. The healer interpreted this as weakness, not warning. Fear settled heavily in the moments before treatment began. The patient could only watch as the healer prepared his instruments, each metallic click or scrape echoing through a body already more tense than it could bear. The act of waiting became part of the suffering. Some stared at the ceiling beams, tracing their uneven patterns in hopes of distracting themselves. Others fixed their eyes on the door, though they knew they could never reach it. The rope marks grew darker with every breath. When the procedure finally started, helplessness magnified the pain. A bound wrist could not jerk away. A tied leg could not recoil. The healer performed his work with an efficiency that ignored the strain on the patient's body. Cries filled the room, but changed nothing. Some patients lost consciousness, their heads falling forward as their bodies sagged against the ropes. Others stayed awake, but retreated inward, their eyes unfocused, their breathing rapid. A few went silent in a way that frightened even the attendants. Too quiet, too still, as though something within them had stepped away. The injuries from the restraint appeared long before the healer finished. Rope burns formed dark ridges across the skin. Wrists bled where the fibers had torn into them. Arms hung numb once the knots were cut loose. Nerves shocked by prolonged compression. Some patients collapsed when they tried to stand, their legs unable to support them after hours of restricted blood flow. The healer dismissed these effects as temporary inconveniences. Families saw something else entirely, damage that lasted far beyond the treatment. Those who brought their loved ones home spoke of trembling hands, stiff fingers, or legs that refused to move without pain. They watched once capable bodies struggle with tasks as simple as lifting a cup or fastening a button. The ropes had altered more than movement. They had left behind a memory carried in the body itself, a reminder that healing had come wrapped in force. Despite this, ropes remained a fixture in Tudor medical practice. No authority questioned their use. No guidelines demanded their limitation. Suffering was framed as necessary, even beneficial. Patients who expressed fear were dismissed as overly emotional. Patients who resisted were labeled dangerous or unstable. In such a system, restraint became proof of the healer's authority, an authority that demanded compliance above all else. Quiet stories circulated among villages, tales whispered about those who entered a healer's room and never fully returned to themselves. These whispers spread not to inspire rebellion, but to prepare others for what might await them. Yet nothing changed. Ropes continued to tighten. Bodies continued to strain. And healers continued to work, as if the suffering bound within those knots belonged to the patient alone, never to the method. Such bindings expose how Tudor healers confused immobilization with cure. Nearby waits another device, its metal frame pressed against the skull before any judgment is spoken. What it claimed to measure unsettled even those who believed they already knew the limits of pain. An uneasy hush often settled over a Tudor treatment room when the iron frame was brought forward, its weight resting heavily in the healer's hands. The device looked rigid, shaped with crude precision, its cold metal polished only by repeated handling. It was placed upon the head of anyone deemed troubled, unstable, or misaligned in the mind. As healers like to say, the patient rarely had time to protest. The frame was lowered swiftly, its rings and bars pressing against the skull before fear itself had fully surfaced. Many did not understand what the device claimed to measure, yet silence was expected. Compliance assumed. The healer believed the skull could reveal what the mind concealed. He traced the ridges along the metal's inner lining, claiming they aligned with the hidden map beneath the patient's skin. Each protrusion or depression was treated as evidence of disorder, as if the shape of bone dictated the shape of thought. The patient sat immobilized, breath shallow, their scalp tightening beneath the metal's grip. Every small twitch was noted. Every tremor was misread as instability. The device did not measure the mind, it measured fear, and the healer mistook that fear for diagnosis. The frame was often tightened without warning. Small screws along its sides were turned until the patient winced. This discomfort was intentional, meant to bring clarity, though clarity never followed. Instead, the pressure spread slowly, pushing against temples, constricting the skull, sending sharp aches across the forehead. The healer interpreted these reactions as proof of sensitivity in specific regions. His notes were filled with imagined meanings, each scribble increasing the patient's dread. The room did not question him. Authority belonged to the one holding the metal, not the one shrinking beneath it. Others watched the process from the edges of the chamber. Family members wrung their hands, forced to accept that the healer knew best. Attendants stood nearby, ready to hold the patient still if fear turned into movement. The metal creaked against bone whenever the frame shifted. Some patients attempted steady breathing, hoping calmness would spare them. Others closed their eyes, retreating inward, as though reducing the world to darkness could lessen the weight pressing against their skull. But the device demanded to be felt. Once fully secured, the healer moved around the patient, inspecting their reactions from every angle. He pressed lightly on the frame, observing how the patient's shoulders tensed or how their breath caught. If the patient cried out, the healer nodded solemnly, as if confirming something long suspected. If the patient remained quiet, he declared them deeply afflicted. No response protected the patient. Silence and sound both became symptoms. Fear and restraint became evident. The device turned any behavior into a diagnosis. The ritual often stretched longer than expected. The patient sat trapped beneath the iron as the healer compared his observations to old notes and forgotten theories. Some fainted under the pressure, their bodies slumping only to be held upright by attendants. Others stayed conscious but felt themselves drifting, thoughts blurring as pain tightened around their skull. When the frame was finally removed, relief came too slowly. The skin beneath was marked with red grooves, tender to the touch, lasting long after the healer declared the session complete. Many who endured the device were labelled with conditions they did not possess. Their lives shifted under the weight of these judgments. Families grew cautious, treating the diagnosed with quiet pity or restrained distance. Some were told not to work alone. Others were barred from making simple household decisions. A few were sent away entirely, placed in grim institutions where the iron frame became only the beginning of their suffering. The healer's conclusions, born from pain and imagination, carried the force of truth. Despite its flaws, the device remained widely used. Healers trusted it with alarming certainty, claiming it revealed what words could hide. Villagers feared it, yet approached it with resignation, believing that any sign of mental unrest required its use. The device offered a false sense of control over something no one understood. In Tudor society, appearances mattered more than accuracy, and a metal frame that seemed authoritative was treated as fact. Whispers spread behind closed doors. People spoke of neighbours who emerged from the healer's chamber changed, quieter, more withdrawn, as though a part of them had been tightened too far and never loosened again. Yet these stories did little to challenge the device's reputation. Pain was mistaken for insight, pressure mistaken for precision. The iron frame continued to descend upon anxious, confused, or simply misunderstood minds, leaving marks that lasted long after the bruises faded. No one questioned what the device truly measured. Not the healer, not the attendants, not the families desperate for answers. The only ones who understood the terror were those who sat beneath its weight, waiting for the healer's verdict while feeling their thoughts tighten to the shape of the metal surrounding them. Such instruments reveal how Tudor medicine mistook force for understanding. Nearby sits a collection of tools kept not for healing, but for swift obedience. Their purpose becomes unmistakable the moment a healer reaches for the locked chest. A muted dread often entered a Tudor chamber before the healer did, carried not by footsteps, but by the tools that lined the shelves behind him. Their shape stood rigid in the dimness, long, gleaming, sharpened, or curved in ways that suggested harm before purpose. Even untouched, they radiated an intent that felt unmistakably violent. Patients who crossed the threshold learned quickly that these instruments were not meant to comfort. Their silence was heavier than sound. Their presence alone made breath shallow, made knees weaken, made the room feel far tighter than its walls permitted. Many tried not to look directly at them. Eyes drifted instead toward the floor, toward the windows, toward anything that did not reflect candlelight off metal edges. But the tools pulled awareness toward themselves, as though each one demanded acknowledgement. Some resembled weapons more than medical devices. Thick-handled saws with serrated teeth, clamps that opened like jaws, knives with points meant to pierce before cutting. These objects told their own stories. Stories the healer never voiced. But the patients understood instinctively. Healers seldom softened the atmosphere. They spoke with a confidence that left little space for doubt. Their voices steady as they chose their tools. They described the body as something that needed correction, not protection. Pain was an expected step, not a consequence. Their calm demeanor only sharpened the horror, a quiet certainty paired with instruments designed to wound. As the healer organized the tools, the air seemed to shift, tightening around the patient's ribs as if anticipating the first cut. The sound of metal intensified the fear. When the healer lifted a tool from the table, the slight scrape against wood made some patients flinch. When he tested its sharpness with his thumb, a faint clicking filled the room. The cold ring of metal meeting metal echoed far longer than it should have. These sounds felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. They lingered inside the patient's mind even after silence returned, as though marking the beginning of something irreversible. Few dared to question what the tools were actually meant to accomplish. The healer's authority was absolute, his explanations brief and vague. If a patient asked why such a device was necessary, he responded with clipped words about humors, imbalance, or the need to release impurities. None of these reasons aligned with the violence the instruments implied. The patient felt the contradiction, but could not escape it. Submission became a form of survival, even when survival itself seemed uncertain. Some tools were never meant for delicate work. Thick blades promised quick removal rather than careful repair. Heavy clamps delivered force rather than precision. Long metal rods carried no softness, no intention of easing pain. These instruments made clear that Tudor treatments valued decisiveness more than accuracy. A patient's body became something to be subdued, opened, drained, or corrected through sheer force. Their cries were not unexpected. Their fear was not remarkable. Their suffering was simply part of the ritual. Attendants stood nearby, their roles silent and unquestioned. They steadied the patient when legs trembled, pressed shoulders down when panic surged, or held a head still when instinct pushed it away. Their presence did not comfort. It reinforced the reality that the tools were not optional. That refusal held no weight. That resistance might only worsen what was coming. Some attendants avoided looking at the instruments themselves, but they knew their shapes. They had seen what they did. The walls of the chamber absorbed countless moments of dread. Generations of patients had entered with hope and left with wounds. Physical or otherwise, the tools remained unchanged. Their edges stayed sharp, their purposes unquestioned, even in intervals of rest. They loomed like silent judges, each one capable of turning a minor ailment into a lasting trauma. They were not created for the faint-hearted, yet they were used on everyone. Despite their harshness, the tools were treated with reverence by those who wielded them. Healers polished them, stored them carefully, and displayed them openly. They believed mastery of these instruments proved skill, authority, and discipline. They believed that through controlled violence, the body could be restored, or at least forced into compliance. The patient's experience was secondary. What mattered was maintaining the healer's image of capability, even when outcomes were grim. When the tools finally approached the patient, fear reached its peak. The mind raced through the possibilities, how deep the blade might go, how forcefully the clamp might close, how long the pain might last. Some prayed under their breath. Others stared blankly ahead, trying to abandon their bodies before the first touch. Many whispered apologies to themselves, as if guilt had led them there. Yet none of this changed the inevitability of the healer's hand. Tudor medicine claimed to serve life, but the tools contradicted that claim, with every sharp edge and cold surface. They did not comfort. They did not reassure. They struck with finality, stripped away dignity, and carved suffering into the memory of anyone who encountered them. Their presence alone reminded every patient that healing in this era often came wrapped in the form of deliberate harm. These instruments reveal how Tudor care blurred the line between remedy and punishment. Yet deeper inside the healer's chest lies a collection so crowded with blades and hooks that the room seems to darken when it opens. What waits within that wooden case is feared even by those who believe they have already seen the worst. Shadows often deepened in a Tudor healer's chamber when attention drifted toward the large wooden chest positioned against the far wall. Patients rarely noticed it at first, but once their eyes settled on its heavy frame and darkened grain, a quiet realization tightened inside them. The chest did not look like something meant for gentle cures. Its iron hinges seemed strained, its surface scratched by years of hurried handling. Nothing about it resembled safety. It carried an aura of concealed violence, as if the wood itself remembered every moment it had opened to expose what lived inside. When the healer approached the chest, silence anchored the room. His movements slowed, as though the act of lifting the lid required a ritualistic calm. As the hinges groaned, a faint metallic scent rose from within, drifting outward before the instruments themselves came into view. Then the light touched metal. Blades, hooks, saws, clamps, and long needles arranged in neat rows that felt more like an armory than a medical assortment. None of the edges looked softened by use. None looked created for gentleness. They gleamed with a hard, unforgiving purpose. These tools were not cleaned between treatments. Dried blood clung in thin lines along the scalpel blades, staining them with a reddish-brown dullness. Tissue residue crusted near the bases of hooks. The teeth of the bone saws held fragments from earlier procedures. As if the past refused to release its hold, the healer did not flinch at these remnants. To him, they were merely signs of experience. To the patient, they were warnings. Each stain suggested someone who had come before, and perhaps not walked away unchanged. The scalpels were heavy, the kind meant not for precision, but for certainty. Their edges dipped slightly, reflecting light in sharp, fractured glints. Beside them lay long iron hooks, curved with unnerving deliberation, shaped to reach inside the body in ways no patient could imagine without trembling. Extractors sat nearby, jaws set wide as though waiting to seize something. Every instrument implied force rather than care. They had been forged to command the body, not to understand it. Bone saws lay deeper in the chest, their serrated teeth aligned like grins carved from metal. When the healer lifted one, dust rose from the wooden grip, followed by the faint rasp of metal against air. Some patients stopped breathing for a moment when they saw it, struck by the realization that these blades were not theoretical tools. They were instruments used regularly, confidently, without hesitation. Their purpose was not hidden. Their brutality was not accidental. Even the syringes, crude tubes of metal with stiff plungers, offered no comfort. Their needles were thick, designed less for precision than for forcing substances into unwilling flesh. The liquids inside were rarely explained. Patients only felt the burns spreading beneath their skin, a sensation that lingered long after the healer stepped back. Whatever these injections were meant to cleanse often left bodies trembling, not relieved. The healer moved through this collection with quiet ownership. He lifted each tool with familiarity, turning it in his hands, assessing its readiness. His calmness unsettled those watching. The instruments looked like weapons, yet his expression held no acknowledgement of their cruelty. He chose a blade the way a craftsman might choose a chisel, or the way a soldier might choose a dagger. Efficiently, without doubt. That certainty was more frightening than the tools themselves. Patients sitting nearby felt their breath tighten as the chest remained open. The instruments seemed to watch them, their hard edges catching bits of candlelight. Some patients looked away, unable to face what might soon touch their skin. Others stared until their eyes stung, unable to stop imagining the shapes sinking into their bodies. The chest shifted their understanding of the healer's role. He was not a guardian of health, but an arbiter of controlled violence. Villagers whispered about the chest long after leaving the healer's room. They remembered the smell of metal, the harsh shine of serrated edges, the sense of dread that settled once the lid opened. They spoke quietly of the way the tools seemed almost alive, waiting for use, waiting for flesh. These memories outlasted their ailments. Even those who recovered recalled the instruments more vividly than the healing. What made the chest so disturbing was not only what it contained, but the normalization surrounding it. No rules demanded that the tools be cleaned. No authority questioned their design. Pain was assumed, even respected. And the chest embodied that expectation. It stood as a reminder that Tudor medicine saw suffering not as failure, but as necessary evidence of treatment. When the healer finally shut the lid, the sound echoed through the room with a hollow finality. The patient often felt changed by that moment alone, as if the closing chest signaled the end of something. Calm, comfort, or the illusion of safety. This unsettling cabinet reveals how Tudor medicine relied on force long before understanding. Just beyond its closing lid waits the final truth. History refuses to soften. Behind those lingering echoes lies a realization that unsettles even those who believed the worst had already been shown. It is strange how objects meant only for harm can survive longer than the hands that wielded them. In quiet museum rooms across the world, behind glass panes that mute every sound, the old Tudor instruments lie arranged as if still waiting for their next patient. Their blades are no longer sharp, their saws no longer stained. Yet something about them feels unfinished, as though the stories tied to their metal have never fully settled. Visitors pause in front of the displays, unsure whether to lean closer or to step back. Even in silence, the tools seem capable of stirring the same fear they once summoned centuries ago. Some of the instruments look deceptively small. A thin clamp, a narrow hook, a pair of tongs no larger than a hand. But their simplicity does nothing to soften their presence. People who view them often describe an internal jolt, a sudden awareness that these items were not misused. They were used exactly as intended. They belong to a world where pain was not an unfortunate accident of healing, but an accepted component of it. That understanding settles heavily, like dust on the glass. Others rest in the museums with a more overt menace. Large saws with wide teeth. Curved blades are designed to sink deep before slicing. Heavy clamps built to snap shut with finality. These objects appear more suited to a battlefield than to a healer's room. Yet they are labelled plainly as tools of medicine. The placards explain their uses with detached neutrality, noting dates and techniques, as though their history can be reduced to simple words. But the true story lies in what is not written, the fear of the patient watching the instrument approach, the restrained body waiting for a cut that could not be avoided, the breath held until it could hold no more. It is hard to stand before these displays without imagining the hands that once held the tools, healers gripping the handles with practiced force, assistants holding down a trembling limb, family members waiting outside, unable to interfere. Each tool carries the memory of touch, even if the metal no longer bears the stains of use. The absence of blood on their surfaces today does not erase the past. Instead, it highlights it. Clean metal is sometimes more haunting than stained metal, because the imagination fills what the museum cannot show. Visitors often describe the feeling that something lingers around the displays. An echo, a pressure, a tightness behind the ribs. The tools do not move, yet they create a sensation of being watched rather than of watching. The glass becomes both barrier and invitation. A thin sheet separating modern safety from an older world where suffering was routine. Many people look only briefly before walking away. A few stay longer, drawn by a mixture of dread and curiosity, and some stand motionless, recognizing that the silence inside the museum resembles the silence of the old healer's room far too closely. Behind each clamp, each blade, each iron rod, lies a story with no surviving voice. The victims left little record. Many could not write. Many did not live long enough to tell anyone what had happened. Their stories were swallowed by time, leaving only the instruments as witnesses. It is unsettling to think that metal remembers better than human memory. The tools, preserved with care and displayed under gentle light, outlast every cry that once accompanied their use. The presence of these instruments forces a quiet confrontation, not with history as a set of distant facts, but with the uncomfortable truth that human suffering was once considered ordinary. Pain did not shock, fear did not persuade. A patient's scream was not a sign to stop. It was a sign that the procedure was proceeding as expected. When people look at these artifacts today, the distance between past and present feels fragile. The glass may separate eras, but the fear itself needs no translation. Some museum visitors report an eerie thought that if the tools were removed from their cases, if they were placed back into the hands of someone who believed in their purpose, the world of the Tudors would return instantly. The tools do not look outdated. They look paused. Their edges could be sharpened again. Their handles could warm again under a healer's grip. History feels less like something gone, and more like something quietly sleeping. Even children who walk through museum halls become unusually silent in front of these displays. They do not know the full history, yet instinct warns them that something is wrong. They feel the weight without needing explanation. This reaction mirrors the old fear of the Tudor patients, who also did not understand the medical theories behind the tools, but understood perfectly that pain was coming. Fear, unlike knowledge, travels easily across centuries. What makes these instruments so haunting today is not simply the violence they once carried, but the fact that they were used with conviction. The healers believed deeply in their methods. Society supported them. Families consented because they saw no alternative. Pain was framed as discipline, suffering as necessity, brutality as care. These beliefs gave the tools legitimacy. Without belief, no blade, no matter how sharp, can shape a life. With belief, even a simple clamp can become an instrument of terror. And so, the tools remain in their glass cases, quiet but not harmless. They provoke thought. They shift breathing patterns. They unsettle hearts long accustomed to comfort. They remind us that fear does not disappear when the blade is put away. It lingers. It echoes. It becomes part of the world that follows. The tools do not scream, but they carry the memory of screams. They do not move, but they seem poised to. They do not judge, yet they expose the cost of ignorance. It is fitting that this story ends, not with the closing of a chapter, but with the presence of these preserved objects. They exist as warnings. Warnings of how easily pain can be justified, how quickly suffering becomes normalized, how deeply a society can deceive itself while claiming to heal. The tools have stopped cutting, but the memory of what they did continues to slice through time with quiet precision. Even now, their shadows stretch farther than the museum walls. Thank you for staying with this story until its final moment. May your night be quiet, your thoughts settle gently, and your rest come without fear. Sleep well,